So there are a couple ways we could handle this formula problem. Because our lease worksheet names are the same value as the lease identifier, we could use an indirect formula. But in practice, I don't love indirect formulas. They tend to be very fragile, they're difficult to maintain. So instead, what I think we'll do is use a find and replace on each row as we need to update the worksheet references. So for instance, in this second row, we can do a find and replace. We will look for the worksheet 1.1 and replace it with 2.1. And that will update all the references in the highlighted cells at once. So it's a little bit more work right now, but we shouldn't be adding a new lease every day. And anytime you do sign a new contract, you'll only have to add it to this disclosure worksheet once. So I don't think this process will be too cumbersome moving forward. So we'll quickly here just update all of our references for each lease. Okay, so then to finish off our balance sheet information, let's add our totals here. So we'll use a SUMIFS based on our classification. And we'll just lock ourselves here, so we always want to be looking in rows 12 through 18, always in our classification column, and looking for our operating or finance label over in column B. Then we should be able to copy this down. And there we go, we have our right of use asset balance, current liability balance, and long-term liability balance in total for both our operating and finance leases. So with that calculated, let's go add the information to our supplemental balance sheet disclosure. So we can find our operating right of use assets here, our current operating lease liabilities here, and our non-current operating lease liabilities here. And we'll do the same for our finance leases. And that's it for our supplemental balance sheet information. With that in place, we can now move to our weighted average calculations. So we'll copy over a subsection here. We only need 2 columns for this. And then we'll give this a different background color. And we'll call this section weighted averages. And the 2 weighted averages we need are the remaining lease term and discount rate. Now for the remaining lease term, we'll need to calculate that, and we have the information required to do so. It will be the termination date of the lease less the reporting date divided by 365. Now, it is possible that we would have a lease included here that was active during our reporting period but is terminated by the reporting date, which would cause our remaining lease term to be negative. For example, let's just switch the ending date very quickly to 12/31/2028. And you can see our remaining term for the 1.1 lease is now negative 0.08. Clearly, we don't want this value to go below 0. If it has terminated by the reporting date, it has no remaining term. So let's wrap this in a max formula, and we want the max of whatever we calculate there, and 0. And now we can copy this down. So now we have the remaining lease term for each individual lease, but how do we go about calculating our weighted average? Well, for the remaining term, the weight we'll give each lease will be the total remaining liability for that lease, which we could calculate by summing the current and long-term liability we've already pulled in here. But instead, let's populate it based on our lease schedules, which will then act as a nice check on our disclosed total liability. So we'll add a column to our general information section. This will be for the remaining liability. So let's copy the right of use asset balance formulas. And then on our lease worksheets, the total remaining liability can be found in column M. So we'll do a find and replace here to replace Q with M. And if we just spot check one of these, let's look at our 2.1 lease. We have a total remaining liability of $169,341. And if we look at our lease worksheet, as of 12/31/2026, we did indeed have a total liability balance of $169,341. So now we'll sum up this total liability for our operating and finance leases. And then let's add the totals to our supplemental balance sheet information and add some checks as well. So we'll round this figure that we've calculated here to 2 decimal places and ensure that it matches the total we calculated here, also rounded to 2 decimal places. And then we'll give this our conditional formatting. So if true, we want it to be green, and if false, red. And then we'll copy this for our finance lease and update the reference. So we want to be looking for our finance lease total here. And now you can see our check is showing true. Okay, so with that completed, let's now calculate our weighted average remaining lease term. Like all other disclosures, we need to separate this for operating and finance leases. So let's say sum product. We want to first look for our remaining lease terms, then sum product that with our remaining lease liability, and then finally we'll add a conditional here to check that the classification is operating. And then finally we can divide that by our total operating remaining lease liability. Then let's just clean up the formatting, lock all the cells that we need to, and we can copy it down for our finance leases. And you can see our finance lease calculation acts as a nice proof. We've calculated a weighted average remaining lease term of 4.25. And we know that's accurate because we only have one finance lease, and sure enough, it has a remaining lease term of 4.25. So now we're ready to do the same for our discount rate. But for this, we calculate it a little bit differently. Instead of weighting based on the remaining liability, we instead weight on the remaining undiscounted cash flows for each lease. And this does make sense because the remaining liability is already impacted by the discount rate. So we instead want to weight it based on the undiscounted amounts. And we'll also need the undiscounted remaining lease payments for each lease later when we get into our maturity analysis. So let's add another column here. We'll call this undiscounted remaining lease payments. And then to calculate this, we'll use a SUMIFs formula. We will sum up all the payments on our lease worksheet if the date is greater than or equal to our maturity date here. So that should capture any cash payment we'll make in the future after our reporting date for each lease. And if we just confirm this really quick, we have $104,100 for our equipment lease. And if we sum up all our payments here beginning in January of 2027, sure enough, you can see it's $104,100 of remaining payments. So we'll lock our cells here, copy this down, and now we'll have to do our find and replace for each lease. So this first one, we'll replace 1.1 with 2.1, and we'll just quickly do this for each lease. Now let's add our totals, and then we need to add our discount rates. So we'll copy over one of these that we're pulling off our lease list. So if we just capture this termination date, copy this over to the discount rate. The discount rate can be found in column J of our lease list. We'll format it as a percentage, copy this down, and now we can add our weighted average. So our weighted average formula will be very similar. So let's begin by copying this over, but we'll need to change the weight based on our remaining liability to our undiscounted remaining lease payments. So we just need to update column F to column G here, and update our total to column G as well. And if we format this as a percentage, we can copy this down. And again, our proof works pretty well. For the finance lease, we're calculating a weighted average of 6.8%, which does match the discount rate of our only finance lease in our list above. So now we're ready to populate this information in our supplemental balance sheet disclosure. So for the weighted average remaining lease term for our operating leases, that can be found here. For our finance leases, here. And then for our discount rates, operating here, and finance here. And that's great, we have all of our supplemental balance sheet information populated. So at this point, we can test our worksheet a little bit. Let's update our reporting period to make sure everything is working correctly to this point. So if we change this to 12/31/2027, all our numbers should change accordingly. And if we spot check this against a few of our leases, you can see for our Chicago office lease, we're calculating a remaining liability as of 12/31/2027 of $301,083, which sure enough matches our total here. And if we look at the right of use asset balance for that same lease, we have $277,957, precisely what we're populating on our disclosure worksheet. So this is a great start, but we do have one more thing to add, namely the maturity analysis that ASC 842 requires us to disclose. So let's tackle that in the next episode.